Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, riders, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Still a work in progress there, but anyway, today in Stories 2, we're going to be discussing and showcasing the status abuse builds, what kind of genes and monsters you can use, what kind of weapons and armors you want, etc, etc. Now this is more of an archetype, and you don't really need to fill your whole team around it, just 2 or 3 monsters will suffice. And this is also more PvE oriented, as I have no experience with PvP just yet, and I'm sure you want to build your monsters differently for that. But anyway, let's just dive into this whole status thing. First, let's discuss why statuses are the thing we're going to be focusing on today. And well, outside of the fact that they're super annoying and everyone knows it, it's just a way to get in some extra damage because they kind of hurt a lot. Noxious and serious poisons hit for about 300 to 500 a turn, and they last 2 to 3 turns. Burns about 250, and bleed can take your next attack and give it more damage. It's all pretty good. Paralysis is great as well because it can stop monsters from moving, but sometimes that does backfire when you're trying to win a head-to-head with hammer and gunlance. Now, status attacks are also very plentiful among all damage types. You can fit them in pretty much every element and every monster. And lastly is because there's a lot of synergies with status. Salt the Wounds, a skill both monsters and hunters can have, increases your damage dealt to enemies under a status, which is just free damage. And if you keep up your statuses, I mean, you might as well have it, right? And both hunters and monsters have a status chaser attack, which will consume the status to deal extra damage with their attack. So status chasers are kind of weird in Stories 2. Now, monster skills for status chasers do medium non-elemental damage only, so you can't really use them on elemental monsters. And they do extra damage when you consume a status to hit with it. It comes in speed, power, and tech variables, so you can't cover all your bases under the non-elemental types. However, these attacks seem almost useless to me. Like, I'm not entirely sure why, but the damage barely increases when you consume a status. Like, with 2 bonus stars, I was hitting for about 500, 590 without any statuses. But when I got to consume a status, I would hit for 680, 710, something like that. And yeah, I know all damages have a range, but it just kind of shows that the damage doesn't really increase a ton to make it worth chasing. I'd rather just leave the status on the monster and use Salt the Wounds. Now, more damage is more damage, sure, and if you're using a bow to quickly apply statuses, it's basically free, so you can do it that way. But if you want to actually chase the status, you're going to want to use your hunter and a hammer. All hammers have a chaser. You can have Poison Para, Blast Burn, and Sleep and Seal. Obviously, if you're using hammer, you want to make sure your monsters can apply those matching statuses to abuse. Hammer chasers hit significantly harder than monsters do, by the way, like double when you have a chaser. They also have 2 ranks of it at charge 1 and 2. It's so much stronger than monster status chasers. You will need to get some skills for your hammers, such as All Out to increase your skill damage, Salt the Wound for status damage, and then the hammer skill to retain charge so you can actually spam your chasers more often. So the idea was to use the monsters as support for the hunter because he can just hit so much harder than the monsters can. Now, setting up the hunter isn't too difficult as you don't have very many options for gear. However, an easy all-purpose setup would be to use Bloodbath Armor for non-elemental boost XL, and the Duramboros Hammer, which has Para Poison Chaser and gets boosted from the Bloodbath Armor since it has no element. Then you slap on a decent charm like Crit, Weakness Exploit, Hammer Charge, All Out, anything like that, all works. Matching those elements with your target is obviously going to be the meta choice, but swapping elements and armors is kind of tedious, and with how many fights you get into, I expect people don't really want to do that. So this is kind of like the safe bet for non-elemental. Now for monsters on the team, I basically have a 2 monster core. For poison application, I'm going to be using Bloodbath Diablos, who has his genes set up for power and speed bingos, with Rathalos and Dread Queen genes to apply poison on both sides, attack and speed, and Peak Rathian's AoE poison. The power skills are from Nergigante for some mad damage, and of course non-elemental boost and health boost. Now you can use any non-elemental monster here. Nergigante is obviously the best monster in the game, so it is the best option, but I don't like using elders. Seregios, Silverwind Nargacuga, and Grimclaw also perform exceptionally well here. You can also use Black Diablos. It just depends on what kind of attack type mon you really want. Now the monster should be able to apply status easily enough without needing application up because Dread Queen's attack is high chance to apply Noxious and most of the other ones are medium high as well. But you can remove a bingo if you want to put in your inflict status rate up just so you can guarantee those poisons more. I also made sure that my speed type Bloodbath Diablos here also had power moves in case they had tech type, so I always want to have 2 different tech types for the monster just so they can cover their weakness. This helps it so I don't have to keep swapping every time a monster changes its pattern. Now for paralysis, I went with Thunderlord Zinogre, because he seems just much bulkier than Kieran. His setup is lacking some bingos, but paralysis is kind of hard to apply even with Inflict Grid up, so I kind of wanted to get as much out of it as I could. And then I also put in All Out to increase the damage of his skills. Everything else here, pretty normal thunder boosting attacks though. And he does have power and tech attacks so he can cover his weaknesses as well. Now when we get Azure Bolt Rise X, we will have some more options for para monsters, but right now, Thunderlord, Kieran, and Ivory Laggy seems to be about our best options. Now Rajang has paper defenses and pretty much dies on trades, so I'm not a huge fan of using Rajang, but he does hit a lot harder than these other monsters. But again, I'm actually focusing on the statuses, not so much the damage from the monsters. However, with this setup, I can kind of cover all my monster types with these 2 monsters. I can cover tech, attack, and speed skills, as well as both the statuses I need for the hammer I use. This is basically my core here for my status abuse team. I plan on making a few other cores with Sleep Seal on Ice Water Mons and Blast Burn with more Fire Mons, but I do kind of need to make some hammer and armor that will pair with that. But the idea is relatively the same here. Use the monster to apply the status to support the hunter. Now you can flip the script and use bow to apply statuses to support the monsters as well, I just don't think the payoff is as high. However, if the target isn't weak to hammer, you're kind of going to have to do that anyway, so you might as well use the other half of your core to make monsters that take advantage of the statuses rather than apply them. And if you're wondering about changing a monster's element, don't bother. They kind of botch that in Stories 2, and even when you fully swap all the genes into a different element, most monsters aren't going to change. As they grow higher in levels, their primary element just gets higher and higher, and so much so that it's basically always going to be your primary element. You can't really boost its lesser elements up to take advantage of that. But anyway, here's the basics for the Para Poison Core. Hopefully you learned a little bit about monster building, and thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.